Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Dr. Alex Korb in Los Angeles, California. Alex is a neuroscientist, a writer, and a coach. He's author of The Upward Spiral, Using Neuroscience to Reverse the Course of Depression, One Small Change at a Time. In its first week, it quickly became the #1 new release in depression on Amazon. He also writes a popular blog for Psychology Today, Prefrontal Nudity, The Brain Exposed. Alex, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Well, it's so nice to meet you. As I mentioned before we got started, I had the chance to read your book, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm really excited to get a chance to pick your brain on all these exciting topics. But before we get into too many questions, I'm really curious, what got you interested sort of in the brain and in mental health? Like, how did you end up on this path?
Well, I've always been really interested in what makes people different from each other. And I think I really got hooked on the brain in particular when I took an intro neuroscience class freshman year of college. And it just covered so many fascinating topics, how the brain perceives and how emotions are processed in the brain, and memory and decision-making. And my interest in mental health grew as I learned more about the brain. I wanted to understand what about the brain made people so different from each other and potentially suffer from mental health issues.
Oh, that's great. Well, so speaking of mental health issues, you have, an area, well, you have many areas of expertise that, encompass the brain and mental health. One in particular was depression. And, for those of us who may be listening and we're not quite sure, what exactly is depression and how common is it?
Depression is a complex disorder. It's in fact the most common mental disorder, and a lot of people think it's just being sad all the time, but it's a lot more complex than that. It often includes aspects of anxiety and insomnia and fatigue and feelings of guilt and isolation. To diagnose someone with depression, there's a whole list of symptoms, and if you have 5 or more of them for at least 2 weeks, then you can be diagnosed as having depression. So that list includes some of the things I just said, but also how things you used to enjoy are no longer enjoyable. It can include thoughts that life isn't worth living. And while a sad mood is certainly a major part of it for a lot of people, in fact, people with depression don't always feel sad. Often there's an emptiness where emotion should be, and everything just feels really difficult. And it's hard for them to explain why, because it shouldn't be. Now, it's hard to describe exactly from a neuroscience perspective what depression is. But in general, it can be described as a problem with how the thinking, feeling, and action circuits in the brain are communicating with each other. And they sort of get caught in this particular pattern that is self-sustaining in a way that when the brain is depressed, it tends to think and act in ways that keep it depressed.
So in terms of how, is it something that many people have, or is it a certain percentage of the population that generally has depression?
Yeah, no, it's extremely common.
Okay.
It's amazing to me the number of times when I tell people I study depression, how the person I'm talking to will just tell me, oh yeah, I've been depressed for a long time. Oh, I have anxiety disorder. Clinical levels of depression affect over 15 million Americans in a given year. And the lifetime prevalence, the likelihood that any given person will have it across their life
Oh, wow.
So it's extremely common. And if we're talking about lower levels of depression, maybe minor depressive episodes, those can be even more common. And also, there are millions more people who suffer from a lot of variety of related disorders, such as anxiety and various anxiety syndromes, PTSD, chronic pain, insomnia. These aren't the same thing as depression, but they're often very related. They rely on a lot of the similar neural systems. And for given these disorders are also often what we call comorbid together, that people suffer from both of them. So there's a huge number of people that are really suffering in some way, and whether it reaches the level of clinical depression or not is sometimes sort of a technical distinction. But the things that things that the life interventions that might help someone with major depression are also the things that could help someone going through a minor bit of depression as well.
Right. No, that's interesting. I'm curious from your perspective. I assume based on what you said about you mentioned to people what you do and suddenly they tell you about sort of their own sort of issues. I get the sense like maybe people don't talk about it to each other when they have these kinds of issues, so they feel even more different or unique with these problems. Is that true? Or, I mean, are people talking about this, or is it something they kind of shy away from?
Well, people don't talk about it nearly as often as they should. There's definitely a lot of people have a stigma against it. Fortunately, I think that's changing in recent years as more and more celebrities, for example, are starting to come out and talk about how they have depression or bipolar disorder or anxiety, and we really start to normalize and see how common it is. Because something that affects 15 million people should not be viewed as some shameful secret. It's an extremely common thing, and the more we talk about it and help people realize that anyone could potentially suffer from depression. It's not some moral failing on this person's part. It's not that they aren't trying hard enough. It's not that there's something wrong with them. It's just a pattern of activities their brain happens to get stuck in. Hopefully we can get people to seek treatment earlier or to talk about it more, because one of the troubling things is that when you are depressed, you often feel more isolated from people around you. You feel disconnected. And if there's a sense that the depression itself is stigmatizing and that you can't share that with people or talk about it, then it's going to make the problem worse. So I think we need to help people understand that depression is just something that can happen. It doesn't mean there's something that's wrong with you. But I think that also goes into just we should be more compassionate and forgiving of each other overall. Because if you're struggling with anything, even if it's not quite to the level of depression, you should be able to talk about that with people without fear of being judged or criticized. And I think a lot of times people don't share their even minor struggles enough because they're trying to appear strong or something, and then by trying to go it alone, they create even more stress and problems for themselves.
I agree. I mean, I think in the corporate world, it's so competitive, especially in certain industries, that you don't want to share anything. I mean, it could be like an ingrown toenail. You don't want to share it, because you can't possibly have a flaw. But I'm certain that not being able to share it when you're struggling has got to make it worse. I mean, I'm curious because I know that you work with individuals, you do some coaching. From what you've seen, when we go through experiences like this, how can it impact us in our professional lives? Like, how can our careers and our work be impacted when we're having these problems?
Well, it can have a huge impact. One of the big problems with depression is that it really saps your motivation. Things that you used to enjoy are no longer enjoyable, and everything feels like it just requires a lot of energy. And for many people, that just means their productivity just goes way down. I mean, they used to enjoy getting stuff done, and they felt productive, but then the motivation just isn't there. And on top of that, for a lot of people with depression, it creates problems with thinking clearly. Like, they feel like their thoughts are trapped in molasses. And those cognitive issues can have sometimes more of a direct impact. Like, even if you had the motivation and the energy to do your work, you can't sort your thoughts out straight, and it just takes so much effort. And that's one of the things that creates the downward spiral of depression. If you lose a little bit of motivation, and then on top of that, the actual task becomes more difficult, then that demotivates you even further, which makes it worse. And that's why depression can be a very stable state.
You mean like once we kind of become depressed, it's hard to sort of shake it at times? Is that what you mean, or?
Right, because if you're feeling demotivated and then the task becomes slightly harder, you're going to be more demotivated and be less productive. And as you are less productive, you have less to be satisfied with, and therefore you just have more to do, and then there's going to be more stress, and you're going to feel even more demotivated, and you're going to accomplish even less. And we need to figure out ways to break that downward spiral, because everyone has setbacks. We all have times where we're feeling down or less productive for a few weeks. But sometimes the brain gets caught in this downward spiral that we can't seem to break out of. But fortunately, there's dozens of little things that you can do to start to break that pattern, which it won't necessarily make you feel amazing all the time. It's not like you can just be happy, decide to be happy all the time. But it can, you can start to stop making yourself feel worse.
Right. Well, I think that's kind of, from what I took away from the book, it seemed like you were giving a lot of suggestions of things that seemed very doable, like go in the sun a little bit more, or look for activities where you might connect with other people. It seemed like some very doable, like small steps that might help to move you away from those kind of negative feelings.
Yeah. And part of that is because we don't have direct access to controlling our emotions. Yet a lot of highly successful people, they're used to being able to control every aspect or fix every aspect of their life. And those same tools don't necessarily work on your emotional state. But you can often have an indirect effect on your mood and emotional state by exercising regularly, for example, or getting bright light exposure during the day and turning off lights at night. I mean, these change your sleep patterns, they change the activity and chemistry in key brain regions, and over time, they can really start to strengthen the brain and have a positive effect. But it's not always, there's not always a straightforward answer. There's not always something that you can do right now that will fix everything, and that's frustrating for a lot of people.
Yeah, you mentioned that, like with highly successful people in particular, that we're often able to control so many pieces of our lives, and that this is maybe one of those things that's harder to control.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that people who are highly successful, do we have higher rates of things like depression and anxiety, or is it a similar level? I mean, how do we compare?
It's not necessarily more common, but it's hard to estimate, but it's certainly as common, or rather, it's that the people have this incorrect view that successful people should somehow be immune to depression, and they're not. Certainly, if you have very low socioeconomic status, you don't have very much money, you experience a lot more challenges in life, and that can increase risk of depression. But simply by eliminating a lot of the monetary challenges in life, and even if you don't have any big quote-unquote challenges, like your life is pretty good, that doesn't make you immune to depression. It's not that something has to go tragically wrong for you to get depressed. High achievers are often at risk for depression because they have unrealistic expectations about their success. For example, if you did great in college and you got your first job and you got promoted and everything's going really well, and then you experience a setback, that can be quite devastating. Or if you are a perfectionist and you assume that you should be able to control everything, and then all of a sudden you can't control everything, that can be really difficult. Also, a lot of times people who are highly successful, I find, particularly if they're very educated, they try and over-intellectualize problems. And you need to realize that you can't always think your way out of a problem. Like I tell people, you just need to exercise more or get more, sunlight exposure at times, or just interact with other people. And they're like, no, what can I tell myself to just snap myself out of it? And it's like, well, yes, there are cognitive strategies to remind yourself of what to focus on, what your goals are, what your values are. But a lot of these strategies, they're not the way that most highly successful people are used to working with problems, I think. It's I can't just tell you the answer and you think about, I just need to think about it in this different way, and everything goes away. For some people, that's really helpful, but maybe if you're just in a rut, you just need to reframe the situation mentally, and that makes everything clearer. That can certainly help if you're going through a bigger struggle, but it probably won't be the entire answer. You will probably have to make some other changes, maybe even include medication or seeking professional help. But doing some exercise actually changes the activity and chemistry in key brain regions. It releases certain neurotransmitters that you can't just release just by thinking about it. Being in a brightly lit environment, an office environment during the day, changes the amount of light that is going through your eyes, which changes your circadian rhythms and can help make sleep more restful. Similarly, turning the lights off or dimming the lights around bedtime or a few hours before bedtime can actually help make sleep more restful, so that you don't need to necessarily get more sleep, you just get better sleep. Small things like writing down things that you are grateful for can actually release key neurotransmitters like serotonin and change the activity in brain regions controlling attention and modulating the communication between the thinking and feeling brains. And some of these small interventions seem so silly, but there's something that's important about doing them. You can't just it's not that you just have to understand them, you have to do them. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is because a lot of them, they're very easy to dismiss as like, oh, deep breathing, yoga, oh, that's just like some new age stuff, like that's not going to help. But now what's been uncovered really in the last 10 years is the neuroscience behind all these small life changes.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore it becomes harder to dismiss because we can say like, no, it's not just going to like make you feel better, or, like connect you with your energy. Like it's going to have measurable changes in brain activity or brain chemistry, just like higher tech interventions such as neuromodulation or maybe taking medication. It's just that for some people, running is the best way to alter their serotonin and dopamine systems. And for other people, well, running might not work as much for them. They need more social interaction and or medication or some other combination. But these are all targeting the same neural system.
Mm-hmm.
So we shouldn't, it's just people are different, and so different things work for different people, but we shouldn't have that's why I always people often have a stigma against medication. Like, oh, there's something wrong with you if you need to take antidepressants. No, it's like people's brains are different. Like, just because your brain responds to exercise and his brain responds to medication, like that's, okay, there's just different ways of targeting the same system.
So I assume like different, I guess it would maybe take someone a while to kind of figure out their sort of perfect combination of, should they be on medication or should they be working out more aggressively? Or, I guess this is kind of a trial and error sort of process. Is that true?
Yeah. But it doesn't necessarily have to take a long time.
Okay.
Even with medication, it sometimes can take a while, but for, say, 30 to 40% of people who they decide to go see a doctor because they're feeling depressed, and the doctor says, yep, and they prescribe them an antidepressant, 30 to 40% of people will get completely better on that first medication.
Oh, wow.
So, like, why wouldn't you take that chance? Like, why wouldn't you see if, you're going to get better right away? And the problem is expectations. Most of us, when we think about going to the doctor, we're like, oh, they're going to give me a pill and cure everything. And like, well, depression is a little bit more complex than that. For some people, that's true. But for the other 60% of people, well, some of them will get mostly better, and some of them aren't going to get that much better, and you're going to have to try and figure out what medication it might work better. And you're going to probably have to make some other life changes that can help make the medication more effective or help treat the depression on its own.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell people, like, well, while you're waiting for the doctor's visit, you might as well try, before even the first time you see the doctor, you might as well try these different areas, like exercising more or putting more activities on your calendar, or just having a more structured work day, or making checklists of things that you need to accomplish, because these things are all going to start to help the brain heal itself, and can be a big part of the solution. And for some people, just making a certain set of life changes may be the entire answer. I have a friend who, it seems like if she just ran every day, she wouldn't have a problem with depression or anxiety.
Okay.
And it's when, there's too much going on at work, and then she can't go for a run, and she starts feeling stressed, and like, but if you realize, like, for me, like, this is really important. Like, I need to create time for myself to do this every day. It's like, and people often don't do that because they're like, I shouldn't have to. Well, like, once you realize, you get a better sense of, like, who you are and like, what your body and brain need. Like, it doesn't matter whether you should have to do that or shouldn't have to do, like, you do have to do that.
Right.
If you want to be happy. So, the original question, I guess, was how long does that take? And for some people, it takes a few weeks, a month of trial and error. Some people, they sort of know the answer. Like, I know I need to, like, hang out with my friends more. Like, I know I need to write more or exercise more. I just, like, I don't want to have to do that. And it's like, a lot of people, I think, already suspect what they need to do in order to feel better. They just feel like they shouldn't have to do that.
Yeah.
And like, well, you need to change your thinking about that.
I could see that. So when it comes to these things like depression and anxiety, what percentage, I mean, because one thing I often think about is like what percentage is genetic versus what percentage is within our control? Like how much of this do we have control over in terms of, the activities that you're mentioning or the sort of the
Right.
strategies?
Right. Well, if you're just talking about mood and happiness levels in general, then a lot of positive psychology studies have shown that it's about 40% that some of our happiness levels are just sort of based on a set point. Like, this is how happy a person you are. And that's based on genetics and early childhood experiences and how those shaped your brain. So some people, like, are just happier than other people. And that's fine. If you're if you're just sort of okay all the time, but you expect that you should be happy all the time, well, then you're going to make yourself feel worse. Instead of just feeling okay, you're like, well, I should feel happier, and therefore you're going to feel like there's something wrong with you and they're bad. So, like, just accepting that there's a range of overall base levels of happiness that we tend to return to. Like, once you accept that, like, okay, that's fine. Like, we don't need to be happy all the time. But we can definitely modulate that more, and by changing certain aspects of our life that we've talked about. Because if you're not well suited for the work environment that you're in, like, it's a really isolating work environment, you like being social, like, well, that's going to be draining and pushing you down from your basal level. And so I think some people they want to think, like, okay, it's all mental or you don't have any control over it. And really the answer is somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
Like, you don't have, that's why I said it's about 40% is what the numbers have figured out. But
so it's
like,
40% that we have control over, or it's 40% that...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And so, like, if you are, let's say you're a normally dark and gloomy person, that's just sort of like your personality, that doesn't mean that you are doomed to be depressed. Like, if you're depressed, well, then yes, we can definitely change that. Or you're depressed and anxious, like, we definitely can, like, improve that. That doesn't mean you are going to be the Dalai Lama. Like, you shouldn't have to be suffering from these terrible disorders, but that doesn't mean, as I said, you will be happy all the time. And I think one of the problems with our society today and Facebook is, like, we've created more of this expectation that you should just be able to be happy all the time, and that's just not true. Like, you shouldn't. Like, if you're okay, then that's okay. Like, but having some control over the situation, even if you are depressed, is difficult for a lot of people to accept, because they either want to think it's either all mental, like, oh, it's just in your head, I need to figure out my way, snap out of it, or I don't have any control over it. And the answer is, well, somewhere in the middle. Like, you have control over some part of it, and you don't have control over other parts of it. Or at sometimes you have control. You can make yourself feel better by going for a run, and other times you can't necessarily make yourself feel better. And people don't like that idea that they don't have full control. It's easier for them to think that they either have full control or they don't have any control. But, like, once you accept that you have some control, then it becomes an experiment. We're like, well, I'll try to make myself feel better, and I know that these different things can help. But if they don't make me completely better, that doesn't mean it was stupid of me to try. Because if I go for a run, for example, and I don't feel ecstatic afterwards, well, it probably helps me more than what I would have done otherwise, which is just sit on the couch. I think it's also important for people to keep in mind, I can't remember, I feel like it was the AA prayer of, like, grant me the acceptance or accept the things I cannot change, and the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Right.
And that applies to everyone. I mean, if you're going through a breakup or a job loss, or just you move to a new city, or just random luck, you just don't happen to be feeling great. It's not that you can change everything about that. Oftentimes, even rejecting the way you're feeling right now makes it worse. You're like, I don't want to be feeling this way. If you just accept, okay, well, this is how I feel, and I know that doing these things can help me feel better, then I will do that. But I think people need to accept that they have some control over the situation, but they don't have total control.
Yeah.
When they accept that, it's very helpful.
I think it's interesting too, you mentioned sort of expectations. I often talk with people who've recently been laid off, for example, or, lost their job for whatever reason. And they often feel like this is, they're the only person that this has ever happened to. And I so often wish I could put all those people together in a room and convince them to talk to each other, because so many of those experiences are very common. But we just choose not to talk about them. And that makes them feel worse, I think, than if we could be, if it could be a little more normal that, hey, that sometimes happens once in your career. Or whatever. Well, so in terms of strategies, there were a couple of things I saw, and one of them in particular I was curious about was something called biofeedback. And of course, being in a totally different field, I'm not completely familiar with it. I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit about what biofeedback is exactly and how it could help us.
Yeah, well, I chose a particularly technical and enigmatic term to describe that because I think it makes it more appealing.
Okay.
The idea is simply, well, there are high-tech ways of doing biofeedback. You could pay someone a few $100s to hook you up to some electrodes and measure your EEG patterns, and sometimes it's called neurofeedback. But the brain is constantly paying attention to the body and monitoring the body for how it should feel. And so by changing certain aspects of your physiology, you can start to influence how the brain is perceiving the body, and then therefore change how you are feeling.
Okay.
So, for example, deep breathing, or changing your posture or muscle tension, changing your heart rate, which is one of the potential reasons that exercise has an effect, is because it's changing your heart rate variability. I think we understand this when we look at babies.
Okay.
You could look at a baby or a toddler, and he's walking along, he's trying to start on, and he falls down. And if your initial reaction is to run over and be like, "Oh, are you okay?" then the baby might start crying. But if your initial reaction is "Oh, that's so cute," then the baby sees you smiling and is like, "Oh, I'm supposed to be," and then it starts giggling and laughing.
Oh,
because
wow.
all it knows is that there's something happened, and it's because the world is so complex. Certainly for a toddler, but still so for us. The brain is trying to figure out how it should feel about that thing. And so, if you're in a stressful situation, or potentially stressful situation, your muscles are all tense and tight, your breathing is short and shallow, well, then your brain is going to exaggerate the tension of that situation and make it feel even more tense. If you start to realize, or the expressions on your face, your posture, if you start to realize how you may be reinforcing that situation, you can start to break that cycle. Then, just take a deep breath. You start to focus on the aspects of the situation that you have control over. That can then change your physiology as well. But it's a feedback loop. Like, your breathing you can directly control, or you could change your thoughts about a situation, which would make you not want to have to breathe hard. But either way often is a way to approach the situation. And I think deep breathing is probably the best, quickest way to deal with a problem. You get a stressful email or something that makes you angry. Like, before you respond, just take a few deep, smooth breaths.
Right.
And you will that will have an effect on how you're feeling about the situation.
That's interesting. So would you put yoga sort of into that same category with, because yoga involves quite a lot of breathing and changing your posture? Okay.
Yeah, well, so I think yoga is great for a lot of aspects of mental health, and partly because of that biofeedback aspect, but also because it incorporates several other aspects that are very helpful in combating depression. So yoga has the biofeedback aspect in terms of breathing and stretching, but it also has an exercise aspect because it's difficult. You're strengthening your muscles. You end up breathing harder because you're working out, and not just because of your intentional deep breathing. But it also has this mindfulness component where your goal is to just notice your own thoughts and notice if you are attached to anything in particular, and just trying to relax. And I think that's one aspect of yoga that is really powerful, is that it forces your body into uncomfortable positions, and therefore your mind has often an automatic reaction to being uncomfortable. And because it's in a controlled, calm environment, you have the opportunity to notice your automatic reactions, and therefore take some steps to then try to calm down. So hopefully over time, it would retrain your automatic reactions. Because when you're at work or at life, like, it's hard to always notice, when someone yells at me, my heart rate goes up, and it's hard to notice that and start to change it. But the interesting thing is the brain and the body only have one stress response, essentially. It doesn't matter if that stress response gets activated by someone yelling at you, or by having a deadline, or by standing on your head, or being in an uncomfortable posture. Like, when that stress response is activated, we can learn to become more aware of it and learn to control our breathing and our thoughts, or be mindful of our thoughts, not necessarily control all of them, because you can't control all of them, in a way that helps to break that habit of automatically responding in a particular way.
That's an interesting point.
To jump back for a second about control, because I just realized that's a great example. Like, do you have control over your thoughts? Yes and no. Like, we all have a voice in our head that we can consciously control. We can tell ourselves to do something. But you also have the thoughts in the back of your head that just jumped out and you can't control those. There's no point in getting mad at yourself because some thought popped into your head. You can only control what you then do about that, or what you then choose to think about that. But there's no point in getting mad at yourself for the parts of yourself that you can't control.
Well, I think you make some really good points, especially about the yoga in particular. I can relate to. I actually do yoga, and there definitely are times where the teacher kind of puts you in these really uncomfortable situations, and you kind of have to just wait it out until it's time to move to the next thing. And you're right. You have to learn to breathe and to focus on, sometimes a spot on the floor or whatever else, to kind of just stick with it. And it can be really tough.
Yeah. Well, and for some people, even just sitting there and doing nothing is intolerable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's some part of yoga is the first 5 minutes sometimes is the teacher just sit there in cross-legged position and okay, maybe it's fine for 30 seconds, but then you're like, oh my, how long am I going to do this for? Oh, my back is hurting. Am I really paying money for this? And that, how your brain reacts to yoga is how it reacts to life.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't realize how many automatic emotional habits we have. And there's nothing wrong with them per se. It's just that if you are living your life in an automatic way rather than in an intentional way, then the consequences can be more out of your control than they need to be. But as you become aware of your habits are just an automatic way of responding. If you like a habit, great. Then let it just play itself out, because then your life will just be magically moving in the way you want it to without you having to make conscious effort. But if your habits are less productive or taking your life in a direction that you don't want to be, then you should become mindful of them to start to change them in an intentional way, because otherwise your habits are living your life instead of you.
Totally. And I completely, when you said, am I really paying money for this? I can completely relate. I have the good fortune of working out with a private yoga teacher. And I mean, every time that it's time to go work with her, I think, maybe I should reschedule this. Every single time I think, God, maybe I could cancel. And then, but because it's a private lesson, I don't, because I know it's, it holds me accountable. And every single time when I come out, every time I think, oh, I'm so glad I didn't cancel, because I feel so great afterward. But I completely relate to that.
Well, and there are a lot of aspects of life that are like that, because shouldn't you just, people might think shouldn't I just be able to do yoga on my own? And well, if you can,
right,
just do it on your own. But but your social system, your focus system might not be that way, and it's helpful to have someone else, and you can't get to as deep a yoga meditation or practice unless you're doing it with someone else. So do it with someone else. It's like running. If you ever gone running by yourself, it's way harder than running with a group of people.
With a group. Mm-hmm.
You can physically if you tried to time your mile running by yourself versus running with another group of people, you'd be at least 30 seconds to a minute slower by yourself, and it would feel more painful probably. And that's not something that you're well, I should be able to think and rationalize my way out of it. No, the brain responds to other people differently than it does to being by itself. And this is not always something that you can just think your way out of.
Absolutely. Well, I don't want to just jump around on topics, but I have something else that I want to be sure and ask you before we run out of time. And that is, I noticed in your book you mentioned a study about indecisiveness at work and about your career, and how indecisiveness can impact you in your career. And I'm curious, can you share with us a little bit about, if we really are one of those people that we ruminate on things a lot with regards to our career, how does that impact us?
Right. Well, one of the I think the study that you're referencing was on people who are indecisive about choosing a career path. And they were experiencing a lot of anxiety.
Right.
And the task that was put to them was simply just pick a career to investigate. Don't try and decide which career you are going to do. Just decide on a career that you are going to investigate for the next 10 or 15 minutes you're going to do some research on.
Mm-hmm.
And they found, some people picked a career, and as they were reading about it for another 10 or 15 minutes, they became more and more excited, and they got more motivated to pursue it. And other people, they picked a career, and the more they learned about it, the less excited they were. But regardless of whether you were right or not, quote unquote, in like the decision you tried to career you decided to investigate,
mm-hmm.
Whether or not it like made you feel better about that career or worse, like the simple act of picking a path and going down it made everyone feel less anxious about the problem
mm-hmm.
of their career overall. And the reason is because if you're sitting at the intersection of a bunch of paths and you have all these paths before you, the tendency for a lot of particularly intellectual people is just to decide, okay, before I do anything,
mm-hmm.
what's the best thing to make? And the reason why they're making that choice is because they don't want to make a wrong decision. Well, I don't want to start doing something and have it turn out poorly because then I'll get really mad at myself. And so it's best to just like not make any mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with that is, particularly if you're going through a rough period in your life, is that the potential for mistake can start to loom larger and larger. And the more you just sit there
mm-hmm.
and do nothing, then the harder and harder it becomes to start doing something. And so the best solution, I think, is you don't have to decide what your ultimate goal is. You just need to start moving in a particular direction.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's say you have two big reports that you're both due tomorrow. And should I work on this one or that one? Who's going to get more mad at me? Like, well, just start working on one. They create an intention to, okay, well, I'm just going to work on this one for 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you are already on a path, then it becomes much easier to have clear thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Because let's say as I'm studying about a particular career change, once I am in the middle of studying about it, it's easier for me to decide, okay, am I feeling better or worse about this?
Mm-hmm.
And that gives me more clarity. So then I can then make another decision. But making a decision to go one way and then 10 minutes or 10 months or 10 years, but realizing like, oh, now I want to go another way, that's fine too.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we place too much emphasis on that. I should be able to make the perfect, correct decision right now, but you can't always, because guess what? You don't have enough information.
Mm-hmm.
You should just start to make a small decision to move you in a particular direction and then be aware of new information as it comes to light and decide, okay, well, do I want to keep going in this direction? Do I want to make a slight adjustment in the direction, or do I want to realize, like, nope, this is clearly the wrong choice? Great, now I have this new knowledge, and from this new knowledge, I will make a completely different decision.
Yeah, I totally agree. I talk with people often who are looking to switch careers, and this
Mm-hmm.
is definitely a huge point of stress, is just what am I going to do? What is my new career going to look like? And I often recommend, which seems kind of similar to what you're saying, it seems related, I often recommend they pick, let's say, 4 different possible career paths and
Mm-hmm.
then start researching those and start doing informational interviews with people who work in those paths. And if they can, especially to go to the offices where those people work, because, I've worked with people who, for example, went into a big corporation, to have an informational interview, and they came back and said, gosh, that environment is horrible. I definitely don't want to work in a big corporation.
Right.
And if it was all mental and you kind of figured out everything without experiencing it, you might get a job at the big corporation, show up on the first day and realize, God, I hate this, and now I'm trapped here.
Yeah,
so,
I think people oftentimes, we don't want to make mistakes.
Right.
And we have this whole region of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that makes us especially human. I mean, humans have more of it than any other animal. And the whole point of it is to try and essentially play chess with the world, like predict what the consequences of our actions might be. Oh, I could do this, but then that might happen, and this, and that might happen. And we think we're perfectly rational in that, but we're not actually that great at predicting how we'll necessarily feel about something. I mean, we're sort of good in certain situations, but we're overconfident in our ability to predict the future. And particularly if we're feeling depressed, then that actually just colors all of our predictions with a bit more negativity. So it becomes even harder to just do it through pure prediction. We really oftentimes need to experience something, and then we'll surprise ourselves to realize, like, oh, like I didn't realize I would feel that way about this situation, or also because we don't have total information. Like maybe in the abstract we wouldn't want to work at a large company, but if you meet the guy who you're going to be working for or your coworkers and you just find them to be amazing people, then yes, you might want that specific company to work for, even though you might not want to work for a large company in general. And the other thing about decisiveness that I found is, let's say someone is looking to make a career change because they can't stand their current job, and they might they might find it difficult to pick this career or another career, and they can become very indecisive. But they need to realize that that's in the context of, well, you can't keep doing what you're doing because you are miserable. And it doesn't matter if you're miserable doing what you are doing, then it doesn't matter what you choose, because this is terrible right now. So like anything, but would be better. And sometimes people resist, like, well, but it might be worse. Well, okay, well then if it's worse, then you can choose another job. But like, if you're miserable doing what you are doing right now, then just picking anything can be an improvement.
Right.
But the more you focus on, the more you focus on the negative potential outcomes, the harder those decision makings are. So you can tell yourself, well, it might be worse, and that is true. Okay, but there's probably only maybe a 10% chance that it's true, and there's a 90% chance that it's better. But guess what? Just because something is true doesn't mean that it's important or relevant, because you already can't stand where you are right now. So even if there's a chance that it's worse, like, well, there's a 100% chance that staying is intolerable, and so there's only a 10% chance that leaving is intolerable. So you should take that on and focus instead of the 10% chance that it could be worse, focus, oh, there's a 90% chance that this could just solve everything. And when you focus on, like, while both the positive and negative outcomes of a decision are true, and the certain various probabilities might be true, the more you focus on the positive potential, the larger it feels, and the easier, therefore, decision-making becomes.
True. So speaking of sort of feeling miserable, and we've been talking about depression and mental health issues, from your perspective, when do we cross the line from something that we can sort of handle on our own and we can work with on our own to the point where we definitely should be seeking, professional help, and we should be reaching out to a doctor or a mental health professional? Like how do we know if we've crossed that line?
Well, it's not always easy to know.
Okay.
But certainly I think one thing is you should try changing some things to see if that helps the problem. Like, if I have some physical pain in my hip, well, maybe I should try stretching or changing up my workout routine at the gym. And, if after a week or two of doing that and it's still not getting better, and certainly if it's getting worse, well, then I should probably go see a doctor. And I think the same thing is true of mental health. Like, maybe you're feeling down for a week or two. Well, like, did you just lose your job? Okay, well, give yourself some time. Realize it's a difficult situation. But even though you're going through a difficult time, like, okay, do the things that will help stabilize your mood and make you feel better. Like, talk to your friends. Like, focus on the good things in your life that you still have. Go for a walk. These things can start to help. But if after a couple weeks the situation has worsened, you feel even worse, or certainly if you ever start to have thoughts that life isn't worth living, then you should probably go see a doctor. So I think the idea is if you can start to make some small life changes and the problem gets better, then okay, great, you might be able to solve it on your own. But if the problem stops getting better and you're still at a point where, like, well, I can't live like this, well, then you should go see a doctor. Or if the problem gets worse, or if it gets just like to a point of severity where that you feel like life isn't worth living, then you should make that step. And there shouldn't be, I think a lot of times people resist because of the stigma, but really, like, okay, this is just something that happens to people sometimes. And, if it's just for a couple of days or so and it's not that bad, like, okay, well, then you often can just, it'll go away on its own. But if it persists, what the doctor is going to see is if it persists for at least 2 weeks, then they might diagnose for depression. So if it gets to a pretty bad place and it's been there for at least a week, well, then probably make an appointment for a doctor. And if it is better before the doctor's appointment rolls up, well, then great. And if it's not, then at least you've made that appointment.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, that's very helpful. And also, sort of on a separate note, I know that you provide both personal coaching and executive coaching, which are a little different than what we were just talking about. But I was just wondering, can you just share with us a brief amount about your coaching practice and, how can we learn more about you if we're interested to contact you for coaching?
Yeah, I mainly do coaching over the phone or Skype.
Okay.
People can learn more at alexkorbphd.com.
Okay.
And that's Korb with a K. Everyone always wants to spell it with a C, but it means basket in German.
Well, I'll put a link in the show notes.
What I found interesting when I first started coaching, you sort of alluded to this, that a lot of your coaching clients have the same issue, is I found that so many of the people that I talked with had the same issue, and that issue seemed to be they're complaining they didn't have enough willpower or motivation. And what struck me about that is that almost all of them had similar life circumstances in that they had some non-standard job. They weren't working a 9-to-5 job. One person was a musician, and one person was a teacher who taught community college some days at one week and taught somewhere else another week and had some private tutoring clients. One guy was a traveling salesman. One guy was a writer, and some days, and an editor other days, and it was all their schedules were not standard and or not the same every day, and their experience of it was, I just don't have enough willpower. I can't stop myself from watching TV when I'm supposed to be working. And what's interesting about that is, like, well, there's nothing necessarily wrong with you. It is just the environment that you are in is creating a difficult situation for you. For everyone has a difficult time with having no schedule and or a set place to be or a set place to work. It's simply how the brain responds. So if you are a writer, for example, and you find it difficult to write from home, well, then don't write from home. Like, go to the library. Because if you're sitting at home on your couch trying to write and the TV is sitting right in front of you, there's going to be a part of your brain that's like, oh, why don't we watch TV? Why don't we just watch TV? And because it's so easy to then just pick up the remote and watch TV, like, it's going to be very difficult to resist that impulse. And you might think, I should have the willpower to resist that. Well, much easier is to go to the library where there's no TV. And you've already, put all the trouble in of getting dressed and leaving the house, so then you're much more likely to just think, well, I might as well get some work done. But a lot of things that people can change in their life are structural and or environmental, that then change their experience of, oh, I suddenly have more energy, or oh, I suddenly have more willpower. For me, for example, I noticed once I started working from home, I stopped going to the gym as much. And I realized because, if I was at work, on my way home, I had to pass the gym. And so it was just really easy. I'll just stop in at the gym. But if I'm sitting at home already, it takes so much energy to go to the gym. And so it feels like, I just don't have the energy or I don't have the willpower. Well, instead, if I just leave the house to go work, then it becomes a much easier proposition to go to the gym. And I think that's one of the things I work with people a lot of, is just identifying the sources of the structural problems that they're having in their life that are making these things a lot more difficult. And then when you combine that with understanding what are the mental and emotional barriers that I'm creating, and how is the brain reinforcing those, that can lead to a lot of positive change.
Well, that's great. So I will put a link to your website, which is alexkorbphd.com, in the show notes and on the website. And then also, I believe we can get your book, The Upward Spiral, we can get it on Amazon. Is that right?
Yeah, that's always what I tell people is the best place to buy it. People often, they're like, can I buy a copy direct from you? I'm like, well, it's going to be cheaper and easier to just buy it from Amazon. But it is available in bookstores all over the country if you can find a bookstore as well.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining me. This has been great.
It was really enjoyable talking to you. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and thanks to those who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to angela@copelandcoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm @CopelandCoach, and on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out, subscribe on iTunes, and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.